"Please don't take my child away," begged the poor widow. Then the silent rancher stepped forward. Dustridge, Wyoming Territory, Autumn 1, 887. The cattle market roared with life. Wagons rattled over rooted earth. Men shouted prices for steers. And the metallic ring of a blacksmith's hammer echoed from beyond the pens. Dust hung in the air like smoke, settling on hats and boots, on weathered faces. It was a day for trade and money. But at the center of the square, one woman knelt in the dirt, bound and broken. Clara's wrists were tied with coarse rope, skin rubbed raw where she had struggled. Her bonnet had slipped back, revealing hair the color of wheat gone dry. Her tears carved thin lines down her cheeks as she reached toward the small child being pulled from her. Emily, her voice cracked. The girl was 4, dressed in a faded calico dress, boots scuffed from long walks. One of Bart Crowley's hired men dragged her toward a waiting wagon. Emily twisted, little hands clawing the air for her mother. Clara had once owned a modest farm, 2 cows, a kitchen garden. But her husband died in a mine collapse that winter, leaving nothing but debt. The bank seized her land. Bart Crowley, a wealthy trader with a vulture's eye, bought the notes. Still, it wasn't enough. Now Bart stood nearby in a black coat that glimmered in the sun, hand resting on the silver head of his cane. His eyes swept over the crowd, then settled on Clara with cold amusement. "You heard the writ widow," he called. "No property, no coin, no collateral. The girl comes with me until the debt is paid." Murmurs rippled through the crowd. No one moved. "Please," Clara begged, voice, "she's just a child. Please do not take her. I'll find a way." Bart's mouth curled into a smile. "Your way ended with your husband's last breath. The girl will earn her keep. Maybe you'll remember what it means to honor a contract." Clara lunged, catching Emily's boot, but a shove knocked her flat. Her shoulder hit the ground. "Mama," Emily cried as the man yanked her forward. "Please don't take my child away." Clara's scream tore through the market, shrill and raw, silencing even the cattle. People shifted. A salesman muttered it ain't right, but didn't move. Dust swirled as Clara crawled, skirts dragging, fingers scraped bloody against the earth. Emily's wails grew fainter. Bart flicked his hand. "Get her out of here. We are done." Clara tried to rise, but was shoved down. She gasped, clawing at the dirt, her child slipping away. Then the crowd shifted. At the edge of the square, a tall figure stepped away from the hitching posts. Boots crunched the hard pan. A wide, brimmed hat shadowed his face. Behind him stood a bay horse, reins trailing. Jack Rohr, the silent rancher, had been watching. Now he moved forward. He said nothing. He did not rush. But with each step, the air changed. Murmurs died. The men holding Emily hesitated. Clara lifted her head. Through blurred vision, she saw him, a stranger yet strangely familiar. Emily reached a trembling hand toward the man. Jack stopped a few paces away. The wind tugged at his coat. He looked at the little girl, then the woman in the dust. He didn't speak, and in that moment, Clara on her knees, Emily held tight, Bart's sneer faltering. Every eye turned to the silent rancher who had stepped forward. Jack Rohr moved with purpose, the dust curling around his boots as he crossed the square. The crowd parted without a word, drawn to the gravity he carried like a storm front. His spurs chimed with each slow step, but it was not the sound that silenced the market. It was the look in his eyes. When he reached the center, he stopped between Emily and the man holding her. He stood tall, weather-beaten, calm. The grip on Emily's arm faltered. The man glanced nervously at Bart Crowley, waiting for orders. Jack did not speak. He looked down at the child, her cheeks streaked with dirt and tears, her little hands trembling, and then at Clara, still on her knees, her face lifted in confusion and desperation. Reaching into the folds of his coat, Jack drew out a worn leather pouch. It sagged with weight. With slow deliberation, He stepped forward and let it drop to the ground in front of Bart. The sound it made, a dull, heavy thud, cut through the murmurs. Bart blinked. His expression caught somewhere between surprise and insult. "What's this?" he asked. Jack said nothing. He simply met Bart's eyes with the steadiness of a man who did not bluff. Bart bent, untied the pouch, and opened it. Gold coins caught the sunlight. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Even the sheriff, who had lingered near the edge of the market, pretending not to notice the drama, took a step forward now. Bart looked up sharply. "That covers the lien," he said, his tone uncertain. "All of it." Still no response from Jack. He stood motionless, one hand resting lightly on the hilt of the knife at his belt. Not in threat, but as if the gesture anchored him to the moment. Bart's confusion twisted into sarcasm. Well, he said, raising his voice so everyone could hear. "The silent rancher speaks with gold. What now? You buying the woman too? Maybe the child comes with the livestock." Laughter fluttered awkwardly in the background, quickly fading under the weight of Jack's unblinking stare. His eyes locked on Bart, not angry, not pleading, just firm, final. The man holding Emily took a cautious step back. Jack shifted, placing himself fully between the girl and Bart. Without a word, he extended a hand. Emily looked up at him hesitant, then moved to his side and clutched his leg. Bart huffed, his pride stung. "You know what this makes you, don't you? A man who throws away good gold for someone else's problems." Jack still said nothing. He turned slowly, guiding Emily back toward Clara. Clara sat frozen, still bound, her lips parted in disbelief. Her eyes darted between the fallen gold and the man who now reached down to her. Gently, without force, Jack untied the rope from her wrists. She winced at the raw skin, but did not pull away. She looked up at him. "Why?" she whispered. He met her gaze but gave no answer. He simply offered his hand to help her to her feet. Clara stood, trembling. She held Emily close, her heart thundering. The square was silent. But for the distant bellow of cattle and the restless clink of tack. Behind them, Bart knelt beside the gold, his fingers lingering on the coins as if trying to decide whether he had just won or lost. Jack, Clara, and Emily walked away from the center of the square. He did not lead them by the hand. He did not claim them. He simply walked, and they followed in front of the entire town. Jack roared. Without speaking a word, had given away what must have been years of savings to save a woman and her daughter he had never met. Not for glory, not for praise, only because it was right. The ride to Jack Roar's ranch was long and silent. The trail led them far beyond the edge of Dustridge, through low hills and weathered plains, untouched by time. Dust clung to the sky in the fading light, wind carrying scents of dry grass and pine. Clara sat stiffly in the wagon beside Emily, fingers resting protectively on her daughter's small hand. She stole glances at Jack, riding just ahead on his bay. He never looked back, but his presence was solid, assured, like the earth itself. He had not spoken a word since the market, not one. The ranch came into view as the sun kissed the horizon. It was no grand estate, just a simple homestead tucked between two hills. A weathered barn leaned westward. The house was plain, paint long gone, roof patched with tin. It looked forgotten by most, but somehow alive. Jack pulled his horse to a stop and dismounted. Without a word, he opened the gate, led the wagon to the barn, and helped Clara down. She hesitated, feet unsure on solid ground. "Thank you," she said softly. He made no sign he heard. Emily peeked from behind her mother's skirt, eyes wide at the unfamiliar place. Jack gestured toward the house, then turned and began unloading. Clara followed him, wary, her body tensed with old instincts, expecting something owed. Something asked, but none came. Inside, the wooden floor creaked with memory. Dust floated through slivers of light between the shutters. Jack led them to a small room at the end of the hall, a narrow bed, a table, and a basin. He pointed to shelves stacked with folded blankets, then turned and left. Clara stood there, stunned by the quiet. That night, she couldn't sleep. She sat on the bed's edge while Emily snored beside her. In the next room, Jack moved, slow, steady footsteps, the sounds of a man long used to silence. The days that followed moved gently like water over stone. Jack never asked questions. He rose before dawn, tended horses, and rode across the land. Clara helped where she could, sweeping, scrubbing, boiling water. She cooked simple meals, and Jack always returned to eat, tipping his hat in quiet thanks before sitting at the far end of the table. It was Emily who bridged the stillness. She followed Jack from a distance at first, watching him feed chickens or mend fences. By the third morning, she trotted after him with a flower crown, holding out a dandelion. "This is for your horse," she declared. Jack knelt, took the flower, and tucked it behind the bay's ear. Emily giggled and clapped. From then on, she called him Mr. Quiet, then the kind, silent man, and eventually Uncle Jack. Clara watched from the porch, how Jack never pushed Emily away, how he paused at her questions, always left a small piece of biscuit for her at breakfast. Still, he said almost nothing, and yet he was present, steady, a quiet rhythm that grounded them both. One evening, Clara sat on the steps while Emily played nearby. Jack returned from the fields, hands rough, shirt soaked. He nodded to Clara, then placed a small, perfect apple beside her. She looked up. "Why are you doing this?" she asked, voice barely a breath. Jack met her eyes for a long moment. Then he tipped his hat, turned, and walked inside. Clara stared after him hard. He had said nothing, but somehow she felt heard, and she began to understand. This man had not saved them out of pity. It was something else, something deeper. She was only beginning to see it. The morning light spilled across the prairie in soft gold, casting long shadows from the fence posts and grazing cattle. Clara stood at the edge of the porch, arms crossed over her chest, watching Emily stumble after a chicken, barefoot and laughing. Her daughter's joy rang out across the dry fields, thin, bright, and healing. They had arrived with nothing but the clothes on their backs. The rest, their home, their keepsakes, every stitched blanket and photograph was gone, sold or seized with the farm. Clara had once owned her mother's Bible, her wedding shawl, a tin box of old letters. Now she had Emily, and she had this place. Jack Roar's ranch. It was a rough life. There was no help but their own hands, no neighbors for miles, no church bells on Sundays. The roof leaked in the corner room. The pump groaned when it drew water. Coyotes screamed at night like ghosts, but it was safe. Clara rose before dawn to sweep the kitchen and boil water. She learned quickly where Jack kept the flour, where the knives hung, how much coffee he liked in the tin pot. He never asked her to work, never gave instructions. He simply accepted it with a quiet nod each time she placed a plate before him or folded his shirt on edge of the table. Emily took to ranch life faster than Clara expected. Every morning she followed Jack like a shadow, trailing after him in the barn, climbing the fence while he saddled his horse, asking endless questions about cows and ropes and saddle leather. At first, Jack said little. He would only gesture or grunt in reply. But soon, Clara noticed the small shifts. He taught Emily how to pat a horse's neck without startling it. He lifted her onto the corral fence when she was too short to see. He found an old bridle and mended it by lantern light, then showed up the next day with a child-sized saddle that had not been there before. When Clara touched the leather, worn but newly stitched, her breath caught. She watched him from the window, sometimes through the steam of the boiling kettle, watched how he moved through the fields with deliberate purpose, watched how he never wasted emotion, never raised his voice. One afternoon, Clara returned from the garden with dirt on her hands and a bucket of potatoes. On the porch sat a clean towel, a small basin of warm water, and a tin of lavender soap, the kind she once used in town. She turned, half expecting to find Jack nearby, but there was no one. Another evening, after a long day pulling weeds in the dry heat, she found a covered plate left by the stove. Inside, cornbread, beans, and 2 fresh biscuits. Jack was already in the barn by then, oiling his saddle as if he had not done a thing worth noticing. It was in these quiet gestures, the ones no one else would have seen, that Clara began to understand. Jack's roar was not cold, he was careful. She saw it in the way he always positioned himself between Emily and the open gate, in the way he checked the barn doors twice before nightfall, in the barn way he sat with them during dinner. Even if he never said more than a few words, the silence no longer felt distant. It felt like steadiness. One dusk, Clara sat on the porch with her feet propped on the railing, a thin breeze lifting her hair. Jack came up from the pasture, hands stained with oil and soil. He stopped near the steps, glanced at her, then held something out. It was a wild flower, pale, purple, delicate. Clara took it, her fingers brushing his. She looked up, searching his face. There was no smile, no declaration. But in his eyes, clear, steady, unwavering, she saw something growing, not pity, not obligation, something warmer, something that needed no name, something that, like them, was just beginning to come back to life. The fire started just after midnight. Clara woke to the acrid scent of smoke threading through the cracks in the wall. At first, she thought it was a dream, the kind that haunted her after too many nights of worry. But then Emily coughed in her sleep, and when Clara sat up, her throat burned. Outside, the night sky glowed orange. She rushed to the window, flung open the shutters, and her heart froze. The barn was on fire. Flame clawed through the roof, licking toward the heavens with a hunger that turned wood to ash in seconds. The livestock screamed, panicked, trapped. Sparks drifted across the dry field like fireflies. From hell, Clara grabbed Emily and ran. Jack was already there, boots pounding the ground, dragging buckets from the well. His shirt clung to him, soaked in sweat and smoke. Without hesitation, he plunged into the barn, vanished behind a curtain of fire. Jack. Clara screamed, but he did not look back. Horses kicked at their stalls, cattle bellowed. Clara set Emily down on the grass and turned, yanking the pump handle with all her strength. The bucket filled slowly, too slowly, and her arms etched, but she did not stop. She could not. Jack emerged moments later, hauling a calf over his shoulder, soot blackening his face. He handed it off to Clara and vanished again. Emily cried behind her, but Clara couldn't pause. Flames exploded through the roof. Jack staggered from the smoke with a second animal, this one limping, and shouted something she couldn't hear through the roar of the fire. Clara rushed to Emily, pulled her back farther from the heat. She looked up and saw 3 men on horseback, silhouetted at the edge of the property. They did not move, they only watched. One wore a dark coat and leaned on a cane even while sitting tall in the saddle. Bart Crowley, her blood turned to ice. He had not let it go, could not stand the humiliation of being bested in public. This fire, it wasn't an accident, it was revenge. Clara turned back just in time to see Jack reappear, leading 2 horses from the burning barn. He slapped their flanks, sending them galloping into the dark. Then, without pause, he went back in. No, she cried. This time he did not come out quickly. Seconds passed, then more. The roof gave a shudder. A beam collapsed inward with a thunderous crack. Clara screamed, rushing forward, but the heat pushed her back. Her knees buckled. Then Jack burst from the side of the barn, half staggering, half crawling, arms shielding his face. The flames chased him to the edge before swallowing what remained of the structure. Clara ran to him. He fell to his knees in the dirt, coughing hard, hands burned red, shirt torn. She dropped beside him, tears cutting clean lines down her ash-smudged face. Emily flung her arms around Jack's neck and held him tight. Clara wrapped them both in her arms, pressing her forehead to his. "If it weren't for you," she whispered, her voice shaking, "we'd have nothing left." Nothing. Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. He held them both close, his chest rising and falling beneath their touch, his arms trembling from exhaustion. From the hill, Bart and his men watched a moment longer, then turned and disappeared into the night. Later, when the fire was just embers and the animals gathered safely in the paddock, Clara sat beside Jack on the front steps. His hands were bandaged now, thanks to her careful work. Emily lay sleeping across both their laps, soot still smudged on her cheek. Clara looked at the ruins of the barn, then at the man beside her. "You saved everything," she said quietly, "even us." Jack didn't speak, but he looked at her, and for the first time she saw past the silence. What stared back was not just strength, it was a vow. In the fire's wake, with everything nearly lost, Clara realized what she had not dared to admit before. Jack Rohr was not just a man who had saved them. He was the one they leaned on now, the one she trusted more than anyone left in the world. The moon hung low and full over the prairie, casting silver light across the land. The worst of the fire was behind them now. What had been lost was already buried, and what remained stood stronger in the quiet that followed. The barn was gone, but the fences were mended. The animals were safe, and the nights were no longer haunted by the crackle of flames. Clara sat on the porch steps, brushing Emily's hair as the child leaned against her knees. The air was cool, gentle, the kind of stillness that came only after surviving something terrible. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and from the barn's remains, the faint scent of smoke still lingered like a fading bruise. Jack was just beyond the fence, leaning on it with one boot. Resting on the bottom rail, watching the horizon, his silhouette was quiet as ever, broad, shouldered, still. He had spoken a few words in the days since the fire, short, practical ones, but nothing of feeling, nothing of why he had done what he did. Emily broke the silence, her voice soft but clear. "Ma," she asked, "do people choose their fathers?" Clara smiled gently, not sure where the question was going. "Sometimes in a way." Emily turned her head, glancing toward the dark figure at the fence. "Can I choose mine?" Clara paused, her hand resting on her daughter's shoulder. "Why do you ask?" Emily wriggled her toes in the dirt. "Because I think I want Uncle Jack to be my daddy." The words hit the air like a breath held too long. Clara's fingers froze in the strands of Emily's hair. Night seemed to pause. Jack turned his head slightly, not enough to reveal his face, but enough to show he had heard. Emily kept going, unaware of the weight in her words. "He's quiet, but he listens. He fixed my saddle, he makes sure we have warm food, he never yells, and when I get scared, he always comes." Clara swallowed, her heart rising into her throat. "Maybe he doesn't say much," Emily said. "But I think he loves us." Jack slowly turned around. His eyes met Clara's, deep, steady, but flickering at the edges with something he had never shown her before. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Not of her, not of Emily, of what her daughter's innocent truth had exposed. He took a small step forward, then stopped. For the first time, he looked lost for words. Emily stood up and padded across the porch, reaching for Jack's hand. He crouched to her level without hesitation, the movement instinctive. She touched his face with one small hand, brushed her thumb across the edge of a healing burn. "Is it okay?" she asked him, her voice hushed. "If I think of you like that?" Jack did not speak, but he nodded once slow. Emily smiled wide and wrapped her arms around his neck. Jack closed his eyes. Clara watched them, her chest tightening with something that was no longer fear. It was longing, it was hope. Jack rose, Emily still clinging to him, and looked at Clara again. His gaze held hers longer this time. He did not say the words. He did not need to. Clara saw it now, what she had been too careful, too guarded to believe before. He had not saved them out of pity. He had not fought for them out of duty. He had done it because he loved them quietly, deeply, unshakably. And though the words were left unspoken, they hung between them in the moonlight, stronger than fire, louder than any promise. A child's simple question cracked open the silence, and in the stillness that followed, Clara saw the truth that had waited all along. Jack Rohr had already become something more, not by asking, just by being. The wind carried a warning that night, dry, sharp, and restless. The moon was a pale sliver, barely enough to light the fields, but Jack felt the unease long before he saw the dust rising on the horizon. He was on the porch sharpening a blade when the sound came. Hooves, not one horse, but many, fast, intentional. Clara stepped out beside him, her arms wrapped tightly around Emily. Jack stood slowly and reached for his rifle, leaning against the wall. His eyes were hard but calm. Clara watched him, her voice tight. "Is it him?" Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. Moments later, torch light flared beyond the outer fence, casting twisted shadows through the trees. A dozen riders or more came into view surrounding the ranch. At their front, Bart Crowley, sitting tall in a dark coat, a smug smile barely visible under the brim of his hat. He raised his hand. "Jacker." Bart's voice echoed across the yard. "You took what belonged to me. I've come to reclaim it." Clara tightened her grip on Emily. Jack stepped forward, rifle in hand, planting himself between the house and the men. Bart laughed. "You think you can keep them, that you can hold off all of us? That woman and her brat are mine by debt and by law." Jack's voice rang out clear, sharp, and louder than any had heard before. "They're not yours." Bart blinked. Jack took another step forward. "They're not something to own. They're not something to steal. They're mine because I chose them, because I protect what's mine." Clara gasped softly. Jack leveled his rifle. Bart's grin vanished. Gunfire exploded. Chaos tore through the ranch yard. Muzzles flashed. Horses reared. Jack dropped 2 men in the first volley, then ducked behind a trough, reloading with precision. The men returned. Fire, bullets ripping through the fence, kicking up dust and splinters. Clara dragged Emily behind the wagon, shielding her with her body. The child sobbed quietly, burying her face in her mother's dress. A bullet clipped the side of the barn. Another struck the water barrel. Jack kept moving, reloading between shots, never letting them flank the house. But he was only one man. A shot rang out. Sharp, close, Jack stumbled. He fell to one knee, hand clutching his side. Blood seeped through his shirt. "Jack!" Clara cried out. He tried to stand, but another shot grazed his shoulder, knocking him back. Clara didn't think. She pushed Emily behind a stack of crates and ran into the open, arms wide, straight toward Jack. "Clara, no." He shouted, his voice with pain. She dropped beside him, shielding his body with hers. "You don't get to do this alone," she whispered fiercely. "Not anymore." Bart rode closer, pistol raised. "Move, woman. You're protecting a dead man." Jack, still on the ground, looked up. His face was pale, blood at his lips, but his voice rose again. Strong, defiant, final. "You don't touch them." Bart hesitated. Jack's eyes burned through him. "They're my family. You want them. You come through me." Clara's heart stopped. So did the gunfire. Bart's men wavered. One turned his horse. Another backed away. Bart. Fury twisted into fear. Then from the trees behind the barn came more riders, neighbors, farmers, ranch hands from miles around, drawn by the fire, by the noise, and by Jack's name. They had come not for pay, not for pride, but because when Jack Roar finally raised his voice, people listened. Bart saw it. He turned his horse and fled. Silence fell. Clara looked down at Jack, her hands shaking as she pressed against his wound. He winced but smiled weakly. "You said it," she whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. "You said it out loud." Jack reached up and touched her face with one shaking hand. "Because it's true." Jack's first spoken declaration in front of the world was not a threat nor a plea, but a truth forged in blood and fire. "They're my family," and that truth was stronger than any bullet. The dust settled in Dustridge. Word of the raid on Jack Roar's ranch spread like wildfire, but not the kind that destroyed, it cleansed. Within a week, Bart Crowley found himself swarmed, not by debtors, but by the very law he had once bought off. Witnesses came forward. Men in town remembered how he tried to take a child as payment, how he'd burned another man's land to prove a point. His name turned to ash. His fortune crumbled, and the town that had once feared him now spat when he passed. Clara did not speak his name again. She had other things to tend to. Jack Rohr had been taken to bed, wounds deep, breath shallow. For 2 days he drifted between consciousness and fever, his face pale against the white linens, his chest rising in shallow bursts. Clara stayed by his side. She never left the room. She pressed wet cloths to his brow, changed his bandages with trembling hands, and whispered to him when the nights grew too still. One evening, as the light dimmed and the wind rattled the shutters, she took his hand and held it to her heart. "You do not have to be alone anymore," she whispered. "You do not have to stay silent, Jack. Not with us, not now." Now, his fingers twitched slowly, his eyes fluttered open, hazy and unfocused at first, then clearer, fixed on her face. He tried to speak, but she shook her head gently. "You have already said everything," she murmured, tears brimming. "When you stood between us and death, that was enough." He closed his eyes again, but his hand tightened around hers. Outside the window, the moon rose, soft and full. In the days that followed, Jack began to heal. Emily brought him wild flowers every morning, placing them on his chest and declaring, "Doctor, Emily says you'll live." When he was strong enough to sit upright, she climbed into his lap and wrapped her arms around his neck. "Can I still call you P?" Jack looked at Clara. She nodded, and for the first time he smiled. The ranch came back to life. Piece by piece, the neighbors helped raise a new barn. Clara painted the porch rail white again. Emily learned to ride bareback and race the dogs through the pasture, her laughter echoing through the hills. And Jack, once a shadow among men, stood tall again, this time with something more than silence in his bones. He did not become talkative, but he no longer hid in silence either. He spoke when it mattered. He laughed once in a while, and each night he sat beside Clara on the steps as the sun fell. One such evening, the sky a soft blend of rose and gold. Clara took his hand. "You never told me why," she said, voice low. Jack looked at her. She didn't press. Instead, he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folded scrap of cloth. He opened it to reveal the faded ribbon Emily had worn the day he met them at the market. Tangled, torn, nearly lost. "I kept it," he said. It was only 3 words, but Clara's breath caught. That night, as the house glowed with firelight and the scent of stew filled the kitchen, Jack kissed her for the first time. No grand speech, no sudden proclamation, just a kiss, firm and steady, born of every silent promise he had already kept. There was no need for a proposal, no audience, no altar. There was only this, a man who had once spoken through gold and gunpowder, now speaking with a glance, a sacrifice, and the hand he refused to let go, and a woman who had learned at last that love need not shout to be true. The ranch no longer echoed with silence. It echoed with life and love. In the heart of the wild West, where silence once meant sorrow, love found its voice through quiet courage and unwavering sacrifice. If this story touched your heart, hit that like button, subscribe to Wild West Love Stories, and ring the bell so you never miss a tale of timeless love and frontier bravery. Here, every story reminds us where bullets missed, hearts didn't. Thank you for watching. Until next time, ride true and love even truer.